you very much, Lily. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's really wonderful to be here. And so I'm going to introduce our illustrious panelists first. So immediately to my left is Ingrid Rojas Contreras, who was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. Her first novel, Fruit of the Drunken Tree, just published by Doubleday, is a New York Times Editor's Choice. Her essays and short stories have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, BuzzFeed, Nylon, and Guernica, among others. She has received numerous awards and fellowships from Breadloaf Writers Conference, VONA, Hedgebrook, the Camargo Foundation, and the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture. You are so young to have won all of those. How did that happen? She is working on a family memoir about her grandfather, a curandero from Colombia, who it was said had the power to move clouds. That's the best author bio I've read in a while. And to her left is Wayétu Moore. She's the founder of One More Book and is a graduate of Howard University, Columbia University, and the University of Southern California. She teaches at the City University of New York's John Jay College and lives in Brooklyn, like me. And then last but not least is Amitava Kumar, who's a writer and journalist. He was born in Ara in eastern India and grew up in nearby Patna, famous for its corruption, crushing poverty, and delicious mangoes. He is the author of several works of nonfiction and 2 novels, most recently Immigrant, Montana, described by Publishers Weekly as consistently surprising and hilarious and inventive delight. He lives in Poughkeepsie in upstate New York, where he is a Helen D. Lockwood Professor of English at Vassar College. In 2016, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. So please welcome them all. This is like the Avengers of panels. It's a pretty formidable group. So I've asked each of them just to do a very short reading, maybe a 2-minute reading of their choice. So Ingrid, would you like to kick things off?
Yes. So my novel takes place in Colombia, and there are 2 young girls who are living through the 90s in Colombia together. So this is one of their point of views. I am in the valleys of my father's farm in Boyacá. I am a little girl. The trees hum. Mangroves and mango trees and the coffee bush. I am crouching. I have found a bird's nest. They are learning to fly. If one falls, the mother will leave it, but I will save it. I hear the crack of a stick. The birds become silent. Before I can turn, a man is on me, gripping his hand on my mouth. I bite. I taste the dirt. I yell, "Papa, Papa, they're here." He hits my head with something hard and metal. I think, my father, my mother, my brothers, my sister. I wake up, and it is dark already. The sky is starred, and the chicharras are singing. The chicharras are loud. I see the tops of trees. I am outside. The air smells like burning. I sit up and see my brother Humberto beside me, bashing his head into the trunk of a tree over and over again. I try to get up and stop him, but I am held back. It is Mami holding me back. More brothers and sisters behind Mami. We're all sitting on the dirt, and I wonder why we don't have mats. Some of my little brothers are crying. My brother Humberto is still bashing his head. Mami says, "They took all of them, Pedro." I look around to see who's missing. My eyes are adjusting. Terrible for the eyes to adjust and see that it is my father who is missing. It is my oldest brother, Tobias, and the second oldest, Ricardo, who are missing. My eyes sting. Who took them, I say. But I know I don't need anybody to tell me, and nobody does. Humberto throws handfuls of dirt at the trees around us. I know it's the paramilitary who have taken my family. It's the paras who have come to our farm day after day harassing Papi. Mami begins to wheeze. "Lie down, Mami, lie down," we tell her. We don't know what to do. We are so stupid, we fan her with leaves. Humberto says Mami is wheezing because when the paras burned down our house, the smoke of the house carried a spirit. Mami has swallowed it. That's what the wheezing is. He calls me Pedro. This is the last night anybody in my family calls me Pedro. Thank you.
Okay, my novel is a retelling of Liberia's history. Liberia has a pretty vast and complex history, and it's made complex by the identities, I would say, that comprise the republic, and that's Native, West African, ethnic groups, freed blacks and former slaves from America, and freed blacks and former slaves from the Caribbean who all immigrated in the 19th century. So my 3 main characters represent one of each of those groups, and I'm going to read to you from a part where the heroine in the novel is acquainting for the first time someone she loves. When she stood and faced him and his eyes caught hers, she recognized his bravery to be true. Bessa suddenly felt drained of all energy. His eyes were brown. Bessa at once wondered what color her eyes were, instantly conscious of everything around her. Mia? He asked again, even more angrily than the first time. Bessa knew he could not kill her and did not care if he could. She nodded. Mia go take your ma to go feed you? Mia go back when your ma died to see you all right? Mia do that? He asked. She swallowed what felt like sharp stones. Pour her head, do that, and then so? He continued. Bessa's heart sank at his words. He had done what he had promised. He was king and indeed the head of the Poro, and now the most powerful man in the village. The darkness of her curse was powerful, but not as powerful as his title, his bravery. And still, whose bravery is not provoked by darkness? Was she that far removed? He breathed as though a part of him wanted to slap her face, while the other part wanted to touch his mouth to her blackness, test it for consistency, try what he knew was more than just a spirit, whose flesh and blood stood before him more rife and sweet than they who refuted it. The two stood in the night, silent, never touching. Just before morning, Safwa turned away from Bessa and returned to the village. Bessa watched until he was out of sight, and then followed him until he reached the house where the old man and woman sat sleeping with their eyes wide open. When they awoke, Bessa watched them together. Their synchronization made her hollow with loneliness. She reached inside for thoughts of the forest and animals, for remnants of the lake's icy chills, but none could come to her rescue. Outside the window, Safwa was running around the village circle with his son, with no stain of the previous night, no lake, no extended stair. "I'm not dead," Bessa said to the couple, who sat monotonously during their days waiting for sick villagers to knock on their door. The old woman answered, smiling. "I livin', I'm not spirit." Bessa persisted and stared out of the window. The couple laughed. The old woman said, continuing to chew her tobacco. "You livin' now. Now you alive," she said. Every night, when the medicine man and woman went to sleep, Bessa went to the lake. Every night, Safwa followed her and watched her through the bush. He had kept his childhood promise, that he would protect her, that she was no different. She trusted the sound of the waves, the illumination of night before anything else. "Fengme ke kamabe, fengme ke mube." Bessa heard the voice coming from behind the bushes in that deep certainty. She looked toward the bush, toward the siren. "Fengme ke kamabe, fengme ke mube," Safwa sang to her. She touched her mouth as his voice came to her on the backs of those night flies, resting on her shoulders, licking her skin. "We have nothing, but we have God. We have nothing, but we have each other," she sang with him, trusting him until morning came.
You're up.
My turn. Hi, how are you guys? It's such a lovely space here, isn't it? The narrator of my novel is a young man who, before he becomes all woke because of a professor who is going to kidnap Kissinger to protest the Vietnam War, he thinks all the fake news is about masturbation, so I'll read that part. Because I was told we were going to read about we were going to discuss
this
fake
was not
news.
the prompt I set, but I guess to each his own, I guess, which is really in keeping with that.
10 years later, for the benefit of a later generation, a sex advice column in Mumbai Mirror had become popular in India. I made this discovery during a visit to India when my laundry came back to my hotel room wrapped in newspaper. Question: my girlfriend kissed the tip of my penis and the next day she suffered a stomachache. Could she be pregnant? Should she take some pills? Answer: she must have had dinner afterward and that probably led to the stomachache. Oral sex does not cause pregnancy and she need not take any pills. Question: I'm a 25-year-old man. Please tell me if regular masturbation can increase the size of one's butt. Answer: just as your nose, fingers and tongue will not increase in size, neither will the butt. By the way, since I'm sorry about that. Since I'm wholly lacking in invention, this is just stolen from one of the columns in Mumbai Mirror. So he is there. Thank you so much. Question: when it comes to sex, my partner allows me to use only a finger for just a few seconds. Please tell me why. Also, when I hold my bowels for too long, my testicles swell and hurt. What could be the reason for this? The good doctor the Sexpert had once again exercised a grim matter-of-factness, the humor in his eyes hidden behind the thick glasses he wore in the grainy photograph. Answer: she's probably scared by your intentions, pregnancy or an infection. Why not ask her? And do you mean balls? Bowels refers to the intestines. Why would you want to hold them? Please explain. In 2014, the New York Times ran a story on the Sexpert introducing Dr. Mahinder Vatsa to the United States. Vatsa's editor said the doctor had received more than 40,000 letters seeking advice. He had tried to promote sex education, but many of his own colleagues said it was pornography. Dr. Vatsa was the first to use words like penis and vagina in the newspapers. A reader filed an obscenity suit against the doctor, charging that the editors fabricated letters to increase readership. In response, the editor delivered a sack of unopened letters at the judge's table. He read them over the lunch hour and dismissed the case. Dr. Vatsa recently turned 91. I'll end by reading the last. The Sexpert column can now be read on the internet. There was nothing like this when I was growing up in India. At that time, if I could have written one, which letter would have been mine? The range of problems people present to the doctor is stunning. But yes, this one. Question: in the last semester, I failed one subject. My parents were worried and took me to an astrologer. He asked me to remove my pants. He said, the ejaculate after masturbation is equal to 100 milliliter of blood, hence my weakness. I am regretting showing him my penis. Please help. Answer: the astrologer is a hoax and completely ignorant of sexual matters. Masturbation is completely normal. Visit your college counselor instead to discuss your not doing well in one subject. Thank you.
Dear Abby, this is not. So I'm very curious. All of your books are beautifully written, and each of them has a very what I think of as a very specific structure to them. And Ingrid, for example, in yours, there is this counterpoint between the two young girls that you mentioned. In Wayétu and yours, there's a cast of characters, and there are fantastical elements that you sort of introduce into that story. And then Amitava, in yours, it's kind of, if I have it correctly, it's almost like we're in the real time, almost seeing the kind of sentimental education of this narrator of your novel. So I'm curious, we'll get to our news discussion, but I'm curious to know how you made these specific choices, like creatively, to structure the books that way.
So the first draft that I wrote had not as many Petrona chapters, which is the point of view that you just heard from. And so Petrona is someone who she's been displaced by the civil war happening in Colombia, and so she lives in Bogota, and she's living in guerrilla occupied territory. And the other character is this young girl Chula, who's middle class, and their two lives are so different from each other. You know, one of them is just going to school and is playing, what do you call it, like ditch dong something, when you ring a bell and you run away.
Oh, dig
yes,
dog
thank
ditch.
you.
Yeah.
So she's playing that, and then the other girl's life is, what I read to you. And I was interested in how this is true of Colombia. If there's such inequality that your experience of the country would be so different,
Right.
based on, where you lived and where you came from. So I think it served that purpose to just have these two coming of age stories that are so different, and these two girls become friends. So they share some things, and then there's this gap between them that can't be bridged.
And Wayétu, in your book too, I mean, we begin with a lot of these characters when they're young and kind of form, they're being formed in a certain way, and and a lot of them they begin in one place and they end up in another. So I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So I finished the first draft maybe about 10 years ago in 2009, and
wow.
and initially it started off as an exploration of this story, this aphorism that I would always be told, which is my author's note, which is at the beginning of the novel. They would say, don't harm our cats. Because remember, there was an old ma who she beat her cat to death, and the cat's ghost jumped to the top of her house and killed her, right? And so obviously that's traumatizing, but the other side of it was also just very curious. So I was raised hearing things like that. And when I was in undergrad, a friend asked me if I'd ever tried to write African fiction, and I realized I hadn't. A lot of my works pertain to, I guess, my cross-cultural identity more than my being African. And so I wanted to flesh out this story. I wanted to give the cat a personality and the woman a name. And after that, after writing that, which was about 15 pages or so, I began to think about, okay, so then what happens when the superstition of it all manifests? And that's when the main character is born. And then when she's exiled, I began to ask, okay, what's going on outside of her village at this time? And because it was mid-19th century or so, I knew that I then wanted to tell the story of Liberia, which can't be told without leaving. And of course, Liberia as a name existed way before the settlers arrived. It was 16 or so ethnic groups that occupied that region, but specifically for the story of the Republic, I knew that I would have to leave. And so that's when I began to examine how I would tell the story of the African-American settlers and the Caribbean settlers that went over and wanted them to be fully realized and contextualized. Also knowing that the two others would serve as supporting characters, right. You call it a cast of characters per se, and then going from there to Monrovia, what was it like when all of them find themselves in the same place while colonialism and imperialism are still very present on the continent, and then of course slavery is going on in much of the Western world toward black bodies.
And then in yours, I mean, it's written in a kind of, there are vignettes that are kind of put together as, again, you sort of see this character in real time. So I'm curious how you thought of it that way, that you decided that would be the structure.
Yeah, if you think of the history of the novel, people would read novels at the moment of its emergence to find out how people behaved, how you were to talk to someone of the opposite sex, for example. In fact, there's a lovely line of John Updike somewhere about how people in the 19th century would read novels to learn how to shave. I don't know whether that is true, but I certainly know that from Bollywood films, people would know how to behave on your wedding night. For a certain generation, you know what I'm saying? And today, I think, novels, to serve the particular purpose in this particular moment, must be those that mix information, which is otherwise so easily available, Wikipedia or whatever, in the most interesting, not just setting, but in the most interesting arrangement. So, for example, a young man dreaming of sex, for example, how to put next to it a little result of a psychological study from the University of Texas that found out that the reasons people gave for having sex included, among other things, I wanted to lose some calories, I was bored, I wanted to change the subject. 257 reasons. Cool. So I thought, how to introduce, in the same way as we sitting here, waiting for a reading to begin, would have been checking our email, maybe updating our our Facebook status update, like waiting with the reading, or checking out Twitter. A sort of an interruptive exercise, an access to information. I wanted to do something like that, where the narrator's journal entries, the encounter in news, and then the actual experiences happening from day to day are interwoven in a way that gives a certain sense of living in real time. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely, and that's what it comes across as. You touch upon a point I talk about often, which I want to discuss with all of you. I think, as we're dealing in this political era, one of the things I kind of mention to people is that I think, telling stories or telling very specific stories about people from particular groups or cultural groups is kind of the way people are going to learn about the empathy they need to kind of realize, or communities that we need to humanize more so that people can really make inroads with them and understand them. And I'm curious how you see that in your role as writer, especially now as you're working, to any of you.
I think I started one of my my reasons for starting the book had to do with being a new immigrant here, and then feeling like I both wanted to move on and could not move on.
When did you immigrate again?
I came in 2002,
Okay.
and I was about 17.
Okay.
And there was also this pressure to kind of like start a new life, and this pressure to not look back.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to. I think that's why I started to write a novel that just looks back. And it's not. It doesn't. It's not the immigrant story that begins here and then it goes forward, but it's an immigrant novel that begins here and then it looks back at how we arrived there. And often I think in our political kind of news cycle, this is lost, like how people arrive, what are the reasons why people are coming. In our news cycle, we care about what are the numbers, are they affiliated to some group, and we don't. There's no news there's no space in the news for hearing, looking in depth to what are some of the constellation of reasons of why someone might leave their country. So books are wonderful in that way. They can expand into that thinking.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Either of you, was there?
You go first.
Yeah.
I need to take.
Okay. I can relate to you in wanting to sort of explore a part of my identity that I didn't necessarily feel connected to outside of my home, because my parents did what they could to tether us to Liberia and Liberian culture, but for the most part I was raised in the outer suburbs of Houston, very white, very conservative, and everything that I was hearing about my home at the time mirrored actually contemporary dialogue around shithole countries. And so I definitely knew that when I became an artist and began to explore literature, that Liberia was somewhere that I was going to go to. I do think that when you are an immigrant, there is, especially an immigrant writer, there's a bit of resistance to telling that story. There's a resistance to telling this, because then you don't want to be seen as like the representative of everyone from where you're from. And so I think initially I may have been resisting it, and that's why it took me so long to even explore African literature. But then when I did arrive there and realize that not only is it important for me, but then also going home and being able to see the responses of people back home, that was something that was very spiritual and showed that there is definitely a lack. Because Liberian culture is close to, even though I wasn't reading about it in school, it's very close to American history, so rooted and based in explorations of Black identity from early 19th century to Reconstruction or so. And I would have friends who would ask me questions about, or not ask me questions, but would make statements like, well, I don't have a place on the continent. And I was like, well, that's what Liberia was at a time. It definitely was that. And of course, now in the age of 23andMe and DNA testing and people making those trips back home, presenting what this experiment was like when you have Black bodies from all over the world placing themselves somewhere on the continent, what happens in that space. And so I knew that the story was something that I needed to tell, and so I stopped resisting and felt led to tell it.
That's why there's this kind of grand coming together over the course of that book. Yeah. Are your thoughts collected?
Yeah. They should respect my age. You know what I'm saying? It's a little slow. My narrator, wanting to humanize, wants to express himself, I guess. If he's humiliated at the visa counter and thinks he's being reduced to a non-entity, or he's being asked, did you want to come back? He thinks in his head thoughts like, did you, wait a minute, I say, did you, the first time you went to the moon, but did you get a visa when you first went to the moon? Fuck the moon. Tell me about Vietnam. Just how precise were your plans there, you asshole? That sort of thing. That's the character in my book. I have a slightly different position. a little distant from it. And also, I wanted to humanize. A more wicked notion was, you don't humanize by giving a face or having needs. When you read stories about the border, for example, people will say, instead of numbers, let's have faces. And so you'll have a name, and you'll have a story, a little backstory. And my wicked idea, if I'm calling it that, was, how about granting someone humanity because they want to be in love, or they want to get laid, or something like that? So I wanted to take that risk of doing that. So a little bit more risky enterprise of humanization. Because my claim in the very beginning of the book is, when you see the unwashed masses standing in lines at JFK, you don't think, what are the words that person has whispered in the ear of their lover, you know? You only say, that person is going to take away my job, or something like that. Does he speak English? As how far as it goes in sociological inquiry. It's not about the depth of their desire, or the nature of their desire. So it's just throwing that into the mix as a crucial part of humanization.
Kind of defining people by their emotional map in a way, that way, yeah.
Or transgressive emotional.
Yeah, right. Are there, not that if you don't have to delve too deeply, any of you, into what you're working on now, if you don't want to, but I'm curious, again, in the past couple years in particular, has it changed the way you write character? I mean, has it changed the way you envision the characters you're writing? Do you feel a kind of political call to action? Do you feel like you have to be even more circumspect in how finely do you delineate somebody's character to kind of make the most effective? Like, how generally has it been a challenge? Has it been exciting? Has it been infuriating?
I would say not with my current novel, but in something that I'm working on now, where it is a Black woman. It's speculative fiction. She's the heroine, but she is somewhat of a villain. And obviously, Black women have been villainized in literature before. Toni Morrison has done it. Octavia Butler has done it. But I feel a pressure, and I would say perhaps even a fear, to perpetuate any image that isn't in line with this narrative of Black girl magic, and making sure that we're just very careful with how we're presenting ourselves and what we're putting out there. And I think as an artist, and also a woman of color and also a Black woman, there is definitely a balancing act, right? Like, how do I balance being true to my art and having the freedom to write these very varied and complex characters who are not always good, but then also being mindful with where we are in sociopolitics in our country right now, and how important representation is, and not wanting to add to the canon of the villainized Black woman.
And the idea of, like, Octavia Butler, for example, her work can be very political, but it's by way of a certain form or genre that allows her to do maybe even more than you could if you were writing just straightforward. Agreed.
And I think that's perhaps how I rationalize it, because I write in speculative fiction as well. But it's definitely a struggle, I would say.
Yeah.
I've definitely felt I've written op-eds about immigration, and they've felt very necessary when I was writing them. Creatively, I keep running into these moments that seem like they're normal moments, and then they become political suddenly. But I've been working on the memoir for some years now, and part of the reason why I wanted to tell it is because I was just sharing, kind of like that line that you read. I was just sharing with someone that I had just met, this white woman, that I was, my grandfather was a curandero, and that people said that he could move clouds. And so she got very excited, and she told me, like, oh, let me explain to you how wind works. and she started to explain that to me. So
never read Borges. You won't understand anything.
So I think that there's even in the most unexpected, just seemingly benign conversations, you can run into these problems that have to do with representation and not having enough representation for our stories. Because when I tell that story to someone who's South American, they will actually, like, tell me a story of their own. Like, it doesn't sound strange. It resonates with them. So it's amazing to me that I want to get there, and that's I think I tend to think very politically, and when I make decisions about what I'm writing, there's always some political consideration going on, and I would say even more so now.
Great.
I would quickly say that partly because we are living in an age of fake news, the idea of the omniscient narrator has clearly become obsolete, in my opinion. I'm putting it a little bit more categorically than I would have liked to, but truth has to be presented in partial terms. It's very necessary to do that, to reveal the positionality from which it emerges. I think so. The other thing I want to very quickly say, it's not character so much that has changed in my thinking about new work, but the idea that what used to be fiction, novels, is now countered by the fiction of daily life. There's nothing that can be imagined or done that is not always already outrageous under the regime of Trump, for example. Every day. So how to write in a way which foregrounds the idea of truth under contestation, or to ask the question, what is truth then? So how to produce a contrasting narrative, that is where my mind is at the moment.
Wayétu, you mentioned a couple authors that you kind of had in mind, but I'm curious, are there particular works that in this moment you've kind of revisited in a way that you find maybe even more influential than you initially thought because they actually seem politicized anew in a certain way? Like, is there something where you've gone back and you thought, now, even when I read this in a long time ago, I didn't kind of realize the commentary it was making, and now I kind of see it put into focus more squarely. Is there anything that comes to mind or anything that you've been moved by?
If you had warned us, we would have thought about this.
Yes, I should have given you a heads up. I'm like,
but go ahead.
well, no, or nonfiction, either. Yeah.
Something extraordinary that I read last year, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. It's a massive book, very thorough and comprehensive on just like the history of race and racism in this country. And I realized my ignorance while I was reading this book, because as you were talking about what is truth, it's so true. Like our culture, origin, they play such a significant role in how we process truth, right? And so then, if that's the case, then is there an absolute truth? I realize that I've been indoctrinated in various ways. And so even my understanding of history and what I consider truth is flawed. And so reading things like that present somewhat of an objective truth just based off of what happened helps me, I think, as a writer, as an artist, as someone who's constantly consuming information in this age. So.
And that book in particular, if I have this correctly, is it's sort of going back through history and sort of contextualizing racism and
Yes.
and kind of the onus put on people of color over history that we sort of whitewashed, to your point, where people forget the kind of narrative that was very crucial. Well, the National Book Award, yeah, right. Ingrid, is there something that pops into mind for you?
I've when I was writing this novel, I read a lot of newspapers. I took 1 year where I read through 5 years of newspapers.
Because your recount such specific incidents that are happening in that country.
Yeah, and I wanted it to feel very real, and there was this tension between wanting to tell a fictional story that's kind of based on my life, but also wanting the world to feel hyper real. So I feel like I was trading back and forth, but the newspapers became this creative space for me, and I started to read them as though I were reading a novel, and it was I've never approached reading news like that before, where you're looking for structure, and you're looking for main characters and patterns. They really influenced how this novel turned out, and I've just even now, like at the time when reporters at the time were disappearing because of what they were reporting on, so the newspapers were this kind of just radical someone's radical insistence on these stories matter and we need to get them out. And people who kept writing through those years. A lot of journalists retired after the 80s and 90s. So I think the newspapers were just very influential.
Yeah, it's funny, even though your book is in the 19th century, there is a kind of 19th century historical novel feel to your book because you're pulling these historical events out and really using them as a really backbone for so much of what's going on in the book. Is there something that struck you anew that, you
Yeah, I'd like to recommend two books. One actually I taught recently. It didn't work in my class, but maybe it will for you. It's a book called Crudo by Olivia Lang.
Oh, yeah.
And crudo, I imagine, I'm told, I understand, is a certain kind of Italian food that is not entirely cooked. And that's how the narrator of the novel encounters the world, in the sense that she's getting married, and people are saying things like, oh, Bannon resigned, at the wedding ceremony, They're looking at their phones and saying these things. So it is an idea of the world as it is being played out and its intersection with her sexual personal life. And that interested me, and I want to say it feels like of the moment, perhaps people will benefit from it. I certainly was excited by it. And the other one quickly I want to say is, because I see Lily standing up, so I think we might be drawing up, is that, a novel that won the Booker Prize 30, 40 years ago, G by John Berger, had a line in it called, "No longer will a story be told as if it were the only one." Now that must have been such a great line because it was used by Arundhati Roy, Michael Ondaatje, Kiran Desai as epigraphs to their novels, And I, being thoroughly unoriginal, want to use it again once more in order to say, how do we understand at this moment that a story cannot be told as if it is the only one? There is something else, always, always, always behind.
If I recall correctly, Colin McCann is a huge John Berger fan as well. So in this kind of fake news discussion, are in terms of how you consume news, as people who write, as people who look at the world in a certain way, what is your news diet? Like, what have you found to be a kind of North Star for you in this crazy world in which we're living?
So I'm related to family who voted for Trump. And one of the things that they told me was that I was brainwashed by the New York Times. And I had, a New York Times subscription, and then I started to read it imagining that it was all fake news. And it was such a bizarre experiment. I did not come closer to understanding what they meant. So it was a failed experiment.
Is that why Trump calls it the failing New York Times?
Yeah.
Right.
This is why. But I read the New York Times. I've been doing a lot of travel recently, so I've been watching a lot of C-SPAN because it's the only.
It's like a crime procedural now.
Yeah. It just seems, I don't know, like the pure thing. And I like to read The New Yorker. And then I read the Colombian newspaper, and so I read about what they think is happening here, and that's also interesting.
Mm-hmm. Is there any particular insight from that you found illuminating?
I mean, it's basically all the articles are just like, what is going on over there?
And you're like, I don't know.
I don't know. None of us know. I don't know.
Wayétu, is there anything that you kind of turn to kind of keep yourself sane and on the straight and narrow?
I think I went through a period where I was binging in news. I just wanted to read everything. What is going on? What is happening? What are the perspectives? What are we at risk of? And then I stopped and I would say, okay, well, no, I can't read any news. But then I found myself out of touch. So I'm with you with the New Yorker and the New York Times. But then I balance it with the Fox News Facebook comment section. Because then
that sounds like torture.
You sort of see like how these people are thinking.
It's like Gladiator over there.
Outside of this bubble that we are very, very much in, living in New York City. And you sort of get real-time responses to the New Yorker and New York Times articles that I love so much. It's like, oh, this is what's going on. This is what they think. So, yeah.
You know, I really admire the people on Twitter who I follow, who follow people I would never follow. You know, like the most right-wing people, the most stupid, who have the most comically delirious conspiracy theories in their mind. And I don't have the courage or the stamina or the nerve to do it. But I always enjoy when they comment on something, making fun of something, then I read it. I said, oh my God. So that's one thing. But what I really do as a good exercise is I ask my students to write 150 words every day, and they have to walk 10 minutes every day. And my 150 words are always about one news item. So that just to keep alive some sort of a critical faculty, what sort of story can I tell about one news item that day? So like yesterday, it was Pablo Escobar introduced hippos. 3 hippos. He had a private zoo, he brought 3 hippos, and now they have become like 55 hippos. And in Africa, those hippos would have been controlled, their population would have been controlled, but in Colombia, there being no predators, and it being tropical weather, it being wonderful, there's no drought to speak of, the hippos are multiplying. They're now 55. So I was like, okay. How to tell a story about it. So yesterday I did that at 1:30 at night.
What happened in the story? Now you have us all like a cliffhanger.
You know what was very interesting in the story? And I don't think you'll all find it very interesting, is there was a guy who was narrating it, but it was not like a traditional commentator. It was a guy who was clearly holding his own camera. So you always saw his one hand hanging low, but the other hand was always stretching out of the frame like that. And you realize that this is a form of production of visual news which has been made available by the availability of the selfie stick. Cool? So he said, now I'm going into the zoo that was started by Pablo Escobar, and you see the hippos. Oh my God, yeah, you see those hippos behind me? Do you see them? Man? So it was like that, right? So for me, that was the more interesting part. How I thought, equipped with a selfie stick, I could become a purveyor of critical news too and put it up on Facebook. Maybe I should discuss this with my students. So that's what I thought.
I don't think this is true, but I always laugh about this like quote unquote fact. I heard that if you ever see a hippo in the wild, you're as good as dead because they're like very violent animals. Anyway, on that note, that's fake news itself. Yeah. So actually, I think now at that logical moment, it's time to open it up to questions. So if anybody has a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to voice it, and Lily will be.
The lady here has a question.
Yes. Great.
My question, this is on.
We can hear you.
Okay. My words are more, it's going to start out being very complimentary of all 3 of you. Thank you so much. I haven't been to India yet.
You should.
So it's
Winter is a good
It's
time.
coming, yeah.
Winter's coming.
I've spent a short time in Colombia, and we had to travel from Bogota up to Choco. That rained, a few years ago, and I remember Bogota to Medellin in the morning and flying, and I could see why travel was so dangerous at that time. And so thank you for telling that story. And I'm Liberian, so I'm bursting with pride. I learned that you were magical realism, this new term. And all we did as kids was listen to stories and make up stories, and now it has a name, and it's in the academy, and I can't thank you. But reading this story helped me go back to our history in a very powerful way. I could see myself, feeling the apprehension, the fear of the settlers, and I began to wonder, about the slave catchers as they would come and, just destroy villages. And people didn't know about guns, but they had these fire sticks. And oh my gosh, this is such a deep book. And don't pardon me, but this story spoke to me in so many ways. And
That's
I can't
wonderful.
thank you enough.
Well, I think that's what every author wants to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that? Yeah. I mean, how does that? You feel
it's
like
hard
a
to
job well
explain.
done?
I have a suspicion she liked it.
It's hard to explain, but one funny thing, when the cat dies, I'm not as funny that the cat dies, but how she describes how the cat dies. I'm like, Wayétu,
were you there? Open your mouth and close his eye and die. Did you see it? Thank you. Congratulations, all three of you, and I look forward to your work.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
How does it? I mean, have you had a particular connection with Liberian readers that where it's been?
So about a month ago, I was in Liberia, went to Monrovia, and did a few readings there at the U.S. Embassy and at some places downtown as well. And I find it fascinating because in a U.S. context, what happens is magic is spectacle. So we have a lot of conversations about the powers and magical realism, as you said. But in Liberia, because, as you mentioned, this is something that's very culturally organic, we all heard stories like this. And so I got no questions about the magic, no questions about genre, speculative fiction. All the questions were about the history. All the questions were about the love story that was unfolding in the book. Yeah, so I think, to answer your question, it's been really wonderful to experience both of those vantage points and how they're processing this story.
And it'll probably be very helpful to you going forward with what you write too. Yeah.
Just say, in this magical realism, talk about fake news. When we can't understand a situation, we give it a little spin. Magical realism, the person disappeared. How did they disappear? Oh, they flew. And not on a plane,
Yeah, I think there's some people we'd love to see fly away on a plane. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't have any questions. I have more of a comment for Ingrid. I'm also from Bogota, Colombia. I've been living here in the States for the past 25 years. And reading your book has been quite the experience. It's amazing the way that you write. But also it has waking up a lot of wounds that I had when I lived in Colombia. And all those memories came to my mind. Reading every page has been beautiful, yet painful. So I haven't been able to finish the book because I have to stop sometimes and I need to think about this and all the memories. But thank you so much for writing it so beautiful.
This is the best audience ever. I feel like, I mean, have you had similar reactions from people where the political nature
I
of it is kind
have,
of?
It's been really wonderful. It's a sad story, and I have I've had Colombians come to readings and they've read the book, and I've heard from Colombians who they were born here, and so their parents don't talk about why they left. So the novel is kind of like their first understanding of what maybe their family is not saying. And I've also met so many Colombians who will then kind of like trade stories with me, and they would be like, oh, this is why I left, and this is what happened to me. And it's been very emotional and just very powerful to speak across that silence that we want to have, and it does take courage and time, so thank you for reading.
Hi, I also teach at John Jay, so how are you doing? And we'll talk a little later. And thank you. And I just want to go back to something that was said about not wanting to be a representative, but then you're a representative anyway. And it touches on just what was said, the power and responsibility of that position when you know there aren't that many voices. And that's for all four of you. You know there aren't that many voices, and that sense of how do you stop yourself from self-censoring?
Do you find that? Do you find that challenge? Do you find? I guess there are two approaches you can take. You can sort of write it all out and kind of see where you are, or you can be circumspect about it as you're writing.
It's a process. It's because in addition to the representation aspect, there's also a familial aspect and not wanting to represent my culture, my parents in a certain way when I was younger. And thank God I got over that. But now there's this weight of, okay, well, I don't want to be too far to the left or paint this character in a way that reflects so negatively of Black women. Because when I was growing up, other than these writers like Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler, and there are maybe about 15 or so that we can all name, that we all say are our influences, there were no other representations. And we're lucky now to be in a time where that canon is a lot more vast. but that doesn't remove the sensitivity. And so I would say I just take it a day at a time. And I also allow friends to read my work as well, to ask their opinions. Did I go too far? Did I not? And I think my first draft is always humanist. And then after the humanist draft, that's when I begin to edit for history and sensitivity and representation. Yeah.
I did a similar process too. Wrote the humanist and then added the history. But there is a responsibility, and I think maybe that's why I did so much research. And I tried to get around my own biases and interviewed people, like interviewed former guerrilla members just to get the other side of what that story was. And because you don't, I mean, I certainly don't want to have the opportunity to get a book out and then get it wrong, you know? So I think that is, you know, because there's not many of us, and that is something that you carry. But it's back and forth. Like sometimes I feel like I'm in a soundproof room and none of those things matter, and I'm just writing. And then other times I'm, you know, worried about it, and I'm like triple checking everything. And
I will give one caveat. That's why I genuinely enjoy books that were published on the continent. There are maybe 5 to 10 publishers there: Cassava Republic, Golden Baobab, Kwani Trust, Kweli. And when they're writing, they're not doing this thing that POCs in America have to do, which is explain your culture in ways. They're publishing and they're focusing on story. The book that came out recently that I really love, My Sister the Serial Killer, Anastasia Brathwaite, is very much in that vein of being for almost the African reader, because you're not necessarily explaining, it's just a story that happens to be on the continent about 2 sisters, one of which is a serial killer, as opposed to sort of leaning into the immigrant narrative or the origin story or the history. And so anytime that I want to snap out of it or step outside of that mold, I will indulge literature that I know was published on the continent, and I think that makes a difference as well.
And Amitava, I would venture to say that most people who encountered this latest novel in particular haven't quite read a novel by a South Asian writer that's written in that style. I mean,
Thank you. I'm taking you out for dinner later. I don't happen to entirely agree that there aren't enough of us. In fact, you can't throw a stone without hitting an Indian writer. Actually, especially if you go to Brooklyn, you can't throw a stone without hitting a Booker winner Indian writer. You know what I'm saying? I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's the truth. You know, there's a great line by the Irish writer Colm Toibin which says, "You've got to be a monster to write." He says, if you have a story, you must tell it. If you have reservations about it, he says, I'll be happy to write you a recommendation letter to join a law profession, but you shouldn't be a writer anymore, that sort of thing. And I always believe that, you know. And I think that one has to actually not only represent in that form, in other words, tell the truth that rubs you the wrong way, but also you should exceed what has been said, otherwise it's useless. So for example, having encountered in a lovely, lovely story by Jhumpa Lahiri, where a young man comes to America and on that day, man has landed on the moon. And he going to sleep that night in a rented apartment, having not eaten much, thinks that man has made this long journey, but that his own journey has also been an amazing, long trip, you know? And I thought, well, actually, monkeys, in tens of thousands, exported from India for experiments here and sent to space before, quote unquote, man went to space, were actually the first immigrants. And for me, to think about the courage of a monkey, which is an intelligence of a 2-year-old, being strapped into a machine he or she does not understand, and being sent into this alien space, and then coming back, and then almost always dying upon impact, not before. That's a different kind of an immigrant journey. And I thought it was more important to press that narrative. So in other words, to exceed what has been said before, and to produce a certain sense of what has been left unsaid. I think that's where we have to go. Not worry about whether we are being I don't know, being tactful or being representative, but instead saying something that is terrible, but true. You know? Does that make sense?
If you,
No. That's a good question. That's a good point. Maybe.
you could write a Planet of the Hippos thing about all the animals that are plaguing you. One last question. Anybody with one last question? Everybody good?
No, my last follow-up was, do you think that was very male?
Yes.
That's a great question. I don't entirely, or it could be. I have no problem allowing that. But I always think, what is enabled by embracing that? For me, like, yes, I don't want to be that, because your original question was about self-censorship. And so for me to think, oh, this is male, so therefore I should be otherwise, is not a possibility. Instead, yes, it is, perhaps, but that's then the path I have to take in order to do that thing. To accept that as, because you were, in the original question, attributing responsibility. And so I want to say, I would want to claim that as my responsibility. And someone else who wants to do something else should do so. But that is what I'll do. You know what I'm saying? And that's what you should do, whatever pleases you. But what you think exceeds the limit of a former representation or the limit of a former articulation.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists for being here. Thank you to Lily for organizing. Thank you to the Strand and
Rakesh.
yes, and for one last question. Sorry, I meant to ask you. What's something you want people to know about you going on? What do you have something coming out? Do you have something you want people to know about? What is it? Quickly, sorry.
I live in San Francisco, but I'll tell you that I'm going on vacation tomorrow.
Oh, great.
You're all invited. Where are you going, baby?
I'm going to Bogota and then Cartagena, so it's just gonna be me and a beach and a coconut.
Yes, this is also my last event of the holiday season, so I'm excited. So I get to go on vacation for a while, but on January 11th, I'm doing a reading at KGB. So if you guys want to come,
Right.
East Village. The East Village, yes.
I'm going to Jaipur Literature Festival in January. You're all invited. It has been described as the greatest literary show on earth. So come.
Great. Thanks again. Thank you.